Okay, good afternoon. I am extending a warm welcome to Dr. Tim Campbell, the Director of the St. Patrick Centre in Downpatrick, who's going to share his knowledge about St. Patrick in his talk, St. Patrick, His Life and His Legacy. Thank you, Dr. Campbell.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So it's wonderful to be here in Lisburn. Can everybody hear me okay? And you can hear me with the... Now, okay, so my name's Tim Campbell. I'm the director of the St. Patrick Centre. March, we've just got into March. Where's the year going, eh? 1st of March 2022, and we are, of course, this time of the year, we always start to look towards the spring, and they say that they turn the stone with St. Patrick on St. Patrick's Day, which is, of course, do you know what date it's on? Is on the 17th of March, of course it is. You'd be surprised the number of people that don't know that, particularly young people. So the St. Patrick Centre, which I represent, I'll tell you a little bit about that, and we're also going to talk about St. Patrick, his life, his legacy, and the local sites which are associated with him, how we're trying to bring that all back to life, and what it might mean going forward. Okay, so whenever we came out of, and whenever we started the St. Patrick Centre 21 years ago, I was a very young, well, a bit younger back in those days, and I was the first director, and the only director so far, of the St. Patrick Centre. I was a historical researcher. I wrote the script for the project, and it was one of 5 signature projects for Northern Ireland. After the Good Friday Agreement, the thought was, well, we need all those people who are coming out of Dublin Airport, instead of going right, we want them to come left. We want them to come up to Northern Ireland and to encourage them to bring tourism and the tourist economy back to Northern Ireland. So I spent sort of the first half of my working life in the St. Patrick Centre encouraging particularly Americans that Northern Ireland is a safe place to be. And then the second, over the last decade, it's been much easier, and of course we've all benefited from more people coming to visit, so that's great. St. Patrick was seen as being one of the projects for that, so we had this creation of 5 signature projects in Northern Ireland: the Giant's Causeway, the Walls of Derry, Londonderry, the Mountains of Mourne, Titanic, and St. Patrick. Those are the 5. And so we have St. Patrick's Country, and sometimes you might see this logo as you drive around. It's got a bishop's mitre, which is the bishop's hat, with a shepherd's crook, a crozier inside it. So you see that as we drive around. And as you will see as you go through that, there's a lot of things that we've kind of added on to St. Patrick, the historical St. Patrick. And he would never have worn a crozier. He would never have worn a mitre, the bishop's hat. He wouldn't have had a fancy crozier either, but the bishop's hat only comes in medieval times. And they start off as little kind of bowler hats, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger the more important the bishops believed they were becoming, you see, until physically they couldn't get any bigger. So going back to St. Patrick's time, well, we have to go back almost 1600 years. Patrick is interesting for a lot of historians, not just because he is relevant to Irish history, but also because he's relevant to British history. He is the first voice of Ireland, so we always say that the story of Ireland begins with St. Patrick. Ego patricius peccator russicissimus, those are the first words that were ever written down, that were recorded, that have survived in Ireland. And ego patricius, I Patrick, peccator, a sinner, russicissimus, seen as the most rustic of many. That's how he introduces himself. So we've got this unique account by Patrick himself, which has survived and has been written out by the monks. The original doesn't survive, but the earliest version of it is in the Book of Armagh, which is now in Trinity College in Dublin. Okay, whenever you go to Trinity College, often you will see the Book of Kells. That's why people go to the, and as in many things in life, the big blousy version is not always the most important, because if you look in that Chubb safe, it's got armour-plated glass by Chubb, and every now and again they turn over one of the illuminated manuscript leaves, which is calf skin. And so that's the big book, about the size of this, the square in this lectern. And beside it is this tiny little book, tiny book. It's more like a diary with spidery handwriting, much more important than the big one, because that's the first version of St. Patrick's writings. And he left 2 pieces of writing behind that have survived, that were picked up by the monks and written by them. One is his confession or his confessio, in which he tells us about his life, and the other one is called the Letters to the Soldiers of Caroticus. Now, Caroticus was a guy who was killing his converts, so he was really giving off probably somebody from, historically and traditionally, people think it was a Scottish chieftain called Calpurnius, or Caroticus, who lived on the rock of Dumbarton. At least that's. And I once went to Dumbarton to find out more about this. And I was driving along out of Glasgow, and I got as far as Dumbarton, and I couldn't see anything. I knew there was a St. Patrick's Well there. So I called into the Heritage Centre, this little sort of visitor centre on the left-hand side, came out in this fantastic dual carriageway. And I called in and I said, I'm looking for St. Patrick's Well. And they looked at me kind of funny. I said, St. Patrick's Well. And I said, yeah, it's around here somewhere. And they went, oh, hold on a minute now. We'll just ring. I've got a historian. There's already a historian. So I'll ring a historian. So they rang a historian, and the man came on the phone. And I said, I'm looking for St. Patrick's Well. I run the St. Patrick's Centre in Downpatrick. He says, oh, St. Patrick's Well, yes. How did you get there? I said, well, I drove up the dual carriageway. Oh, right. He said, well, St. Patrick's Well's under the dual carriageway. They built it over the top of it. So anyway. But whenever Patrick was alive, back in the early 400s, so if you get a time frame, he is supposed to have brought Christianity to Ireland in 432. Okay? I always say if he came in 321, that would have been easier again. But he came in 432, and he comes to the island of Ireland, and to him, this is what the island of Ireland would have looked like. It's a map by a Roman, not quite a contemporary, but another Roman called Ptolemy. And in it, he's actually seen quite a lot of the way that Ireland would have looked. The Lagon River is, I think I can maybe use this. Can you see it up in the top on the right? Oh, there we go. So you see it? Actually, that's the Lagon River there. That's the Boyne. That's the Liffey. Okay? So that is, and I think that's maybe the 6 Mile Water. But that's the Lagon River there. Okay? So Lisburn was on the map. Well, if you knew where to look. To Patrick tells us he was born on the, well, just to sort of zoom in a bit, this is a slideshow I have for people who maybe don't know much about exactly where we are in Ireland. Obviously Ireland, the northern part of Ireland, and particularly the bit between Armagh and Downpatrick, and of course Lisburn's right bang in the middle of that, is where St. Patrick, most of the historical associations with St. Patrick are based. We have, and you can drive a St. Patrick's trail, a driving trail. Sometimes you can see the signs. They go from Armagh through Newry to Downpatrick and up to Bangor, where there's another famous early monk, somebody who came after St. Patrick, St. Columbanus. So it's a kind of saints trail. And more recently, we've got a walking trail, the St. Patrick's Camino or St. Patrick's Way, which goes again from Armagh, but you walk through Tandragee and down the towpath, and you get to Newry, and then you get across to the mountains of Mourne, up through Newcastle, and you end up in Downpatrick. And we say Camino, there's two magical words there. There's Camino, this idea of walking, and particularly walking with some sort of, it doesn't have to be it's a spiritual reason often, but the Camino of Santiago de Compostela in the northern part of Spain, a lot of people do that. Actually, 80% of the people who walk that don't have a religious interest, but they have an interest in some spirituality, and often they're people who are there for exercise, or maybe they just need a little bit of headspace and time, and that's very popular. You can imagine how much headspace we need after all this COVID. So that is something that I'll tell you a little bit about in a while. But to get back to St. Patrick, he tells us quite a lot about himself in his confession. He tells us that he was born on the island of Britain. Okay, so the first thing that, and I have to break this news to our American cousins whenever they came over thinking Patrick is Irish, the first thing you need to know is St. Patrick is not Irish. He tells us he was born, very specifically tells us where he's from. He says he was born in a place called Banaven Tabernii. The problem is we've no idea where that is. So we think probably in the southern part of Wales, the southwestern part of Britain. He tells us that whenever he was 16, he was living with his father, who was a cleric, and his grandfather was also a cleric. His father was called Calpurnius, his grandfather was called Petitus. and probably lived in a villa estate rather like this. Now, to the Romans, Ireland was a land at the end of the world. Literally, they called it Hibernia. And Hibernia is a Roman weather forecast. It means the land of perpetual winter. And you can imagine, if you're in the Roman Empire, you could have come from Turkey or anywhere around the Mediterranean basin where it's nice and warm. And then you get as far as Wales and you're thinking this is pretty cold. And then you're looking across at this island. Now, the Romans said they could invade Ireland if they'd wanted to with a legion or two. But, they thought, really, why would you bother? However, the Roman influence did come here, and the Roman influence comes through St. Patrick, of course, because he was a Roman Briton. And he brought the official religion of the Roman Empire to Ireland. And all the little dots that are going up onto the map now are places where there have been Roman finds. So archaeological finds of things that have something to do with the Roman world. And it's not terribly surprising that a lot of them are around Dublin and the southeast, because there was a lot of trading links between the Roman Empire and the northern part of France particularly, and Britain. And there's a lot of kingdoms, and it's a wee bit like, Dalriada in the northeastern part of Ireland, where up in the Antrim coast, the O'Neills and the Lords of the Isles, a lovely title, but the northeastern part of Ireland was tied through this kingship to the southwestern part of Scotland. So there's always been a connection across these places. And of course, the Romans and bits and pieces of Roman treasure or rings and things come backwards and forwards. So different archaeological finds have been found in all these spots that I've put up above. There was recently a big ring found, a Roman ring found on Murlough Bay in County Down. But the archaeological people say it wasn't really found in Murlough Bay. Well, they discovered it. It was recorded as being found in Murlough Bay, but they think that it was found somewhere else and somebody just put it there because they didn't want them to come digging. Maybe they were in a building site or something, you see, so that was kind of a convenient thing. But it was a Roman ring, all right. And this is the sort of world that Patrick would have come across. Ireland was a place... people didn't tend to drive through Ireland, obviously, because there were no roads. It would have been very dangerous. It was covered in... It was a patchwork kingdom of little tribes and kingdoms, and it was difficult to get from one place to the other. This is actually a view of Slemish. So his first impression, I guess, of Ireland was whenever he was 16. I think it's the early 400s. Now, another date to remember is 410, 410. The Roman legions decide they're going to go back to Rome to defend it against the barbarians. People like Patrick and his family, who've been Roman citizens in the province of Rome the province of Rome had been there for hundreds of years. So the Romans leave it undefended. Then we have people from Ireland coming over in raiding parties, and they come and they loot, pillage, and they take people as slaves back with them because they traded in slaves. And Patrick tells us that he is brought with a great number of other people in a raiding party one night, and he's brought back to Ireland to be a slave. Now, just to make things slightly more complicated, would not have been Ireland, it would have been Hibernia. The people who lived here were not called the Irish. In those days, they were called the Scots, or the Scotai, okay? Slightly later, but the power vacuum that the Romans create whenever they leave allows the Irish, or the Scotai, to invade the northern part of Britain and rename it after themselves, Scotland. Okay, so I always joke that the Scots are the Irish who could swim. Okay, there's always been this connection between the two places. But anyway, so Patrick would have been brought over as a slave. He's 16, cold, hungry, isolated from his parents. And he's made to be a shepherd slave for 6 years, which is going to be a big shock to him because he grew up in a rather privileged Roman background. He was able to complete 3/4 of his education. He always said that he was russissimus because he was a rustic, because he was not able to complete his education. Elocution, which I could do with today, I'll tell you. Elocution was the last part of it, and and he didn't do that. So he was a shepherd slave on Slemish for 6 years, and this is Slemish in County Antrim. A few pictures of that. Herding sheep. He would have, in those days, people would have lived in and around, been a very wooded, Ireland was a very wooded island, and it was a patchwork quilt of little kingdoms. So these are some of the kingdoms in different colours that would have been here. The O'Neills are the ones in the green, and that would have gone sort of, think of Antrim and down. The O'Neills would have been the people, or O'Neills, as it later became, would have been the people in charge here. So he would have, people worshipped in high places. They worshipped around rivers and trees. And this is the kind of modern version of it. When you see them going to Stonehenge and sort of pretending to be Druids, it probably didn't look like that at all. Julius Caesar was the person who wrote about the Druids and the people who would have been here originally. And Ireland was a little store, a medical store, and a storehouse of all the traditions of the Celts, because the Celts had been kind of watered down in other places because the Romans had invaded, particularly in France and in Gaul. So we exported hunting hounds, pelts, furs, hides, medicines, imported stuff we couldn't make, like wine, cheese, beer, things like that. Again, whenever people reenact what it may have looked like, you start to see stuff like this. These are Americans who have got a reenactment society, and it's very popular over there, but they wouldn't have looked like this. Okay. A lot of the people would have been worshipping trees, water, and they also worshipped a horned god called Cernunnos, who was the fertility god. And this is what Cernunnos would have looked like in some of the... So they were, Celtic beliefs. We have some things that are left behind, like the Boa Island figures behind me there. So we've got some, and the Tandragee idol. So there's some figures left in the landscape archaeologically which show us the sorts of things but of course you can't get into their head. The difference between what you see archaeologically and what you read is that whenever you're reading St. Patrick's Confession, you're actually getting inside his head. Whenever you see something that's physical, you have to guess at what was in people's minds whenever they were making it. So the idea of Patrick banishing snakes from Ireland is not true. There's several things about Patrick you need to know, and that's one of them. He's famous for banishing snakes from Ireland. There are only two major landmasses in the world, two countries in the world which do not have snakes occurring naturally. One of them is Ireland. Where's the other one? Very far distant. And here's a clue, they're good at rugby. They're good at rugby. New Zealand. So only Ireland and New Zealand in the temperate world are the two places which do not have snakes occurring naturally. And it's nothing to do with St. Patrick. There was a land bridge from Europe to Britain, after the last ice age, 10,000 years ago. We didn't have that. So we have limited flora and fauna, and we don't have snakes. Nothing to do with St. Patrick. But if you think of that serpentine god, Cernunnos, and you see the snake-like emblems that are often, whenever he was represented in these serpentine patterns, like the horns on his head. So we think that Patrick is banishing not the wriggly guys, but and this is a sort of more modern version of it, but not the actual physical snakes, but the serpentine motifs which represented the pagan gods. Okay? Not the wriggly guys, because we didn't have them. And this is the Gundestrup cauldron, and you can see again Cernunnos in the middle there and he's holding a snake actually in that, just to make it even more apparent. So coming back to County Down, St. Patrick's Country, this is how we tell visitors about it, where we say that every stony acre has a name, and many of the names have some association, if you can only untangle it, with St. Patrick. Even the tallest of our mountains there, Slieve Donard, Slieve Mountain. Donard was one of Patrick's missionaries. Okay, so the St. Patrick Centre is here. It's the only permanent exhibition in the world about St. Patrick, and we bring kids together with a cross-community education program, and We also have a cafe, which over the years we've run with young people with learning disabilities. And we've got an art gallery, so we support local people. This is just a bit of a trip through what we do. Got a little craft shop that we support people. We work with external organisations like the Benedictines, who created Down Cathedral originally with John de Courcy. You've heard of Jean de Courcy. And St. Patrick has been reinvented a number of times. The early monks wrote about him in their what they call hagiography. It's where you write about saints. And they said, well, St. Patrick, he founded Armagh. He's very important. The problem was he wasn't buried in Armagh, which created all sorts of intertown land difficulties between County Down and Downpatrick particularly, and Armagh. So the early monks, they wrote about him and said, well, Patrick created Armagh. He is our founder. He brought Christianity to Ireland. Strangely enough, he dips out of the record for about 100 years, and then he kind of comes back again with these monks writing about him. But they have to admit that Blessed Patrick was not buried in Armagh, so they had to come up with a reason for this. And they said, well, whenever Patrick was dying, he said that 2 oxen should decide where in Armagh his body should be laid to rest. And they turned out to be wayward cows. They took a wrong turn somewhere near Newry, maybe somewhere near Lisburn, and they ended up going to Downpatrick, which of course not where he wanted to be buried at all. So, but the fact that they had to excuse it does lead credence to the fact that he is and has been celebrated to be buried there for the last 1,500 plus years. And the landscape hasn't changed a lot. One of the walks that we do is a Camino and canoe, and to get out in a canoe and to walk a little bit and then actually get onto the water. This landscape hasn't changed much since St. Patrick was there, and the water was the way to get about. Now, I always remember going over to the Isle of Man, and there was a conference on, and I was taken to lots of lovely places, including Peel in the Isle of Man, which is in the northwestern corner, and there's a whole parish dedicated to St. Patrick. There's a lot of Viking stuff there too. If you're interested, by the way, we have a conference coming up, and the Inspector of Historic Monuments from the Isle of Man will be at our conference at the St. Patrick Centre on the 18th and 19th of this month. But Peel, and I said to the people there when I met them, I was introduced to some folks, and I said, well, I run the St. Patrick Centre. They said, where are you from? I said, I'm from County Down. Oh, County Down. I said, have you heard of County Down? And they looked at me as if it was stupid. And they said, of course we've heard of County Down. We watch the sun going down over the mountains of Mourne every night. That's how close they are, you see. So think of the Isle of Man as an apple green on a motorway, because that's exactly what it was. The Irish and various other people, they used the Irish Sea as the motorway. They didn't cross land, because if you had a lot of stuff in a cart, somebody was liable to take it off you, but if you were at sea, you're more likely to get away. So the Irish became great seafarers. So he would have brought his curragh, which is it would have been a wooden framed boat with a tarred cowhide on it. He would have brought it up there, just as we these days bring canoes. And I've got to say, when you get onto the water, it really makes a difference. You really start to feel like you could be travelling in the footsteps of St. Patrick. And of course we have St. Patrick's grave, which is in Downpatrick as well. So we get great value for money. We joke, we say, well, actually it's true, we've got 3 saints for the price of 1, okay? It's like a supermarket, great 3-for-1 deal. We've got St. Patrick, but we also have St. Bridget, and we've just had St. Bridget's Day, and St. Columkill. Okay, so St. Bridget more associated with Kildare and the Dublin area. St. Columkill brought Christianity to Scotland, okay, Iona. And so we have a medieval rhyme. Behind them is the medieval cathedral. So think of the early monks, they recreated St. Patrick's story because of Armagh. Then in medieval times, Jean de Courcy comes from Dublin with 18 or 20 knights, and they have a great victory in the Dun, the Great Dun. Now, we are I'm trying to remember. We're just about in County Antrim here, aren't we? I've crossed the Rubicon, didn't I? Okay. Well, the whole county of Down is named after the Dun, and Dun means fort, and the Dun is one of the biggest megalithic hill forts in Western Europe, and it's in Downpatrick. So the whole county's named after it. Okay, so that's where John de Courcy headed there because the early Celts the O'Neills had their headquarters there. And he built a motte. You know a motte and bailey. It's like a fortified. It's like an upside down sort of pudding. You know, if you see it on top of the hill fort, it's like a little pimple. It's tiny. It's quite big. You know, it's a regular motte size, but on top of that, it's very small. So he came there in the 1170s. He recruited some monks from back in France to come and build, Benedictines, to build a cathedral to honour St. Patrick. He went St. Patrick mad. He got the Book of Armagh that we were talking about earlier, sewed it into his pillow, according to tradition, and slept on it every night. Built the cathedral, renamed the settlement Downpatrick, the Fort of Patrick, and he made sure that St. Patrick was buried in what would have been, on that site there was an early Christian monastic foundation. So they had a look in the church, and they made sure that they found the remains of St. Patrick, St. Bridget and St. Columkill, and they were reinterred here in the 1170s on this spot outside the church. It's kind of odd because a lot of saints you have to go inside the church to see, but these are outside. The stone is not ancient. It was put there about 120 years ago because people used to come to St. Patrick's grave for a cure. So a lot of people would have come and they would have taken a scoop of earth, there's this idea, it's a kind of a Celtic idea, where if you went to war, you would lob your enemy's head off, put it in a bag and bring it home because you wanted a part of their power. And to feel, we look mostly the same from here down, so they wanted that bit up. So there was, in places like Carnac and other places in France, they actually have totem poles where they would have put the severed heads of their enemies in to draw some of their power. That kind of feeds through in the early Christian community, where you start to have reliquaries. So you've got a little bit of St. Patrick. There's the shrine of St. Patrick's jawbone. There's a shrine of his hand. So there's different parts of it. And the idea is that if you got a bit of St. Patrick with you and you're going into battle, well, that's not going to do you any harm, is it? It's going to bring a little bit of their power. So people used to go to St. Patrick's grave and they would take a little bit of soil from it. So many people were doing it that there is one photograph in the late 1800s of what it looked like, and it was like somebody had excavated it, so they really needed to put this on top. So Francis Joseph Bigger, the antiquarian, came along and he got this stone from a quarry in the Mournes, granite stone, put it on top. Okay, it has a cross on it that's copied from a similar stone in Clonmacnoise, which is another monastic foundation. And that's, you see, it simply says Patrick, Patric. Some people say the bit on the right-hand side was blasted off by American GIs during the Second World War. Not true, because I've looked at some of the old photographs. I think it was made to look a little bit old, and it never had a K, Patric. Patricius. And within a few miles of Downpatrick, just to follow the story of St. Patrick, so he comes back. We kind of left him in the mountain. So on the mountain, he's there for 6 years on Slevemish or Slemish mountain. And during that time, he starts to remember his father's faith. His father was a cleric. He's 16. He's there for 6 years. By the time he's 22, he believes that God has spoken to him. He prays up to 100 times a day, believes God tells him to run away, that a ship has been made ready. So he escapes, runs to the southeastern part of Ireland, hitchhikes with some sailors, and they get him off the island of Ireland. Unfortunately, they become shipwrecked, and unfortunately, off the north coast of France, we think, start to starve. They pray to their pagan gods, these sailors, nothing happens. And Patrick says, "You get this strange Christian god." They say to him, "Why didn't you pray to him?" So Patrick prays, herd of pigs appear, sailors much impressed, decide they're going to convert to Christianity. So he's escaped, he's made converts, he comes home to be with his people again, and then he becomes a cleric himself. Okay, so he's found his faith, and he decides, eventually, he believes in his dreams one night. By this stage, he's a bishop. So he's probably, life expectancy in those days was probably about 50, so he's probably about 30, probably about 10 years after being a slave in Ireland. He decides that he's going to come back. He believes in his dreams, he's told to come back to Ireland, the place of his childhood nightmares. And he comes back, and he arrives, not by incident, not by accident, in the area of Downpatrick. Why Downpatrick? Because that's where the king lived. He wanted to come and influence the king. If he influences the king, makes him Christian, then everybody else is going to be Christian. So he kind of operated like that. And he meets a man called Deku. Deku has a barn. Deku doesn't like the look of him, sets his dogs on him. Again, a lot of this, Patrick does not say much about this at all, I have to tell you. He is very vague about the geography. He talks a lot about his spirit, and you can see that he's a deeply religious person. Geography's not, RE's good, geography not so good, okay? So it's later tradition that has kind of built up the whole story, but the later tradition is that he comes to meet a man called Deku. Deku set his dogs on him, and I don't know if Patrick was some sort of dog whisperer, but Patrick prayed. Dogs pacified. Deku much impressed. Eventually he becomes his first Christian convert at a place called Saul. And now Saul, or Sabel in Irish, means barn. Okay? And it means a barn because he gave him his barn to be the first church. And I bring Americans in there and we'll sit them down and we'll say, now, I tell them that story and I say, he gave him a barn to be the first church and you're sitting in it. It just blows their mind, because it's a little space not much bigger than your garage. And it's been restored, of course, over all these 1,600 years. That's the most recent version of it. But it's always been in the same site. It's important for two reasons. It's important because it's the site of the first church, but it's also important because when Patrick died, can you guess what date he died on? 17th of March. 17th of March is the date he died on. And it kind of surprised me too, because you think, well, why are people celebrating the fact that he's dead? They celebrate it because it's his Ascension Day. They celebrate it because that's the day he went to heaven. Okay? And, a lot of people you don't really know. Your birthday may not have been recorded. It wasn't a big thing back then, but your Ascension Day was important. That was the day that people celebrate you. So maybe not a great day for Patrick, but we've been celebrating him ever since. But he died in that space on the 17th of March, and I bring so many people there from different traditions and faiths, and many people will come and they will say, oh, this is a thin place. They'll just go through the door and they'll say, this is a thin place. And I used to wonder what that meant. Other people would say that it's a heavy place. And what they mean is, a thin place is where heaven and earth are close together. So they feel something spiritual whenever they get there. Heavy places where they feel the weight of heaven. Okay, so it's a beautiful place just to go, and it's so simple. It's got one stained glass window, and that's St. Patrick coming ashore. Very, very simple. And of course, we've been bringing people from all over to come and experience that. It's a great cross-community feel, because everybody from all traditions come together, and then we have a cross-community service, and then as a community we lay a wreath. And if we look in the educational curriculum for one thing that binds everybody together, surely it's someone from Britain who became the patron saint of Ireland. How more cross-community could you be? So, of course, the Irish Sea, there is also St. Tassach's Church. This is probably what Saul looked like before it was restored. St. Tassach was the person who's supposed to have given him the last rites, and that's another historic monument, which is very close to where Patrick is buried. That's just a nice photograph on St. Patrick's morning, a long time ago, of Down Cathedral. You can see how impressive it is. Now, it was Georgianized. It became a ruin. Henry VIII decided he was going to change the official religion, of course, in the 1530s. He's having a bit of marital difficulties. He changes the official religion, and places like this and Inshabi and all those huge monastic foundations, they all go into decline. And it was restored in the 18th century by actually Lord Downshire. And there was a toss-up between having the cathedral in Hillsborough or having it in Downpatrick, and eventually there was money given by George III to Downpatrick, and they restored it the way that it is today. And this is what it looks like inside. So, you know, it's a medieval cathedral. Can you see anything odd about what's happening in that cathedral? That is actually on St. Patrick's Day, yeah. But if you're sitting in church, what's the odd thing that you see in this picture? Yeah, they're not looking at the altar. What are they doing? They're looking at each other. And these guys here are the clue to it. These are Benedictines who come often. And the Benedictines, does anybody know how Benedictines celebrate? They chant. One of them will come with a little tuning fork, and he'll hit that, and he'll chant over to the other ones at the other side of the room, and they'll chant back. So it is designed like this so that you can sing backwards and forwards. And it's been many, many different, James Galway and all sorts of people have come, and it's a lovely acoustic space. The lady in it, who's now retired, used to say that every sound sounds good in here apart from the bagpipes. And she says, and you can always tell a gentleman. And I said, what do you mean, Joy? She said, a gentleman is someone who knows how to play the bagpipes but chooses not to. So there you go. And this is the Benedictines coming out and singing. You know, it looks very, tremendous, doesn't it? You know, whenever they're doing that. You get your stew and apple pie afterwards, yeah. And then, you know, everybody lays, well, this is particular chap who laid a wreath in St. Patrick's grave, but you have people from different faiths and traditions invited, and then we celebrate St. Patrick's Day with St. Patrick's flag. Now, flags, as you know, can be tricky. But we encourage people to fly St. Patrick's flag, which is the white flag with the red X. And actually it was the Irish flag in medieval times, and it was put into the Union Jack after the Act of Union as the bit that represented Ireland. And then we've got Struel wells, which are some of the earliest healing wells in Ireland, and they're very close to Downpatrick as well. And of course the monks wrote about Patrick, and this is just a for instance of what that might have looked like. And as you look around other parts of this area, you could go down to, for example, Drumore to see some of the high crosses. So Patrick starts a tradition of people within a Christian movement coming along, building monastic foundations, and then you start to see archaeology showing up like crosses. Monastic foundations were important because they were proto-towns, they were the early towns. People couldn't read and write. And generally they didn't live together, so the monasteries were able to teach people how to do all these things. So he starts this whole tradition. This would have been what Downpatrick probably would have looked like originally, the monastery before the cathedral was there. It's like a bullseye and a dartboard. So the bit in the middle, this is Nendrum, okay, down by Strangford Lough. The bit in the middle there's the church, that's the round tower. That was actually burnt down by the Vikings, with the abbot still inside in the 800s. And then that's the inner sort of sanctum part. Then the monks would have lived here, and they would have had a scriptorium and a metalworking and everything. And then the laity would have lived around here. So it was like a little town. And that's what it looks like. And of course they're starting to read the time, which is another thing that comes along with the monks. They're able to read the time. And that is, I don't know if you can see it there, but there's a sundial. And with Nendrum also, they were able to reveal that the monks are pretty clever. These guys had a water wheel, but not a water wheel that goes round like you'd expect on a mill. It's a water wheel that was on its side, and every time the tide came in, it turned. So it's one of the earliest water wheels and it used the tidal inlet of Strangford Lough. Think of all those millions of gallons of water going in and out. So they were able to grind their corn by using that. So they were no dozers. Well, Nendrum's still in state care. It's like this is Devonish, you get a better idea of what the original round tower would have looked like. And there was a round tower in Downpatrick as well until Georgian times, and they decided whenever they were rebuilding it that they were going to take it down. So that's, again, often these monasteries were built near water because that's where you were able to get onto your highway or your motorway, and you would be able to take your goods backwards and forwards. And it's the same in Downpatrick. Where the St. Patrick Centre is, if you know that part of Downpatrick, just below the cathedral, it was surrounded actually on three sides by water. The Celts used to worship there. The reason Patrick is buried there is because it was a place of Celtic worship. And the Celts, remember, they used to worship in high places around water, around trees. The trees there are still called the Grove. So you've got the trees, you've got the height, and you had the water surrounded on three sides. So that's why the Celts worshipped there. And the monks liked the water too, because they needed to get stuff in and out. And of course, we keep digging things up. So recently we had an excavation around the medieval cathedral, and we had a big dig and found all sorts of medieval pottery. Just like some of this earthenware. And oyster shells. See the oyster shells? Oyster shells come from pilgrims. Do you know the Santiago de Compostela, the symbol is a scallop shell? Yeah? So, you know, people were wearing these shells as emblems to show that they were pilgrims. The thing about pilgrims is that they, which is something that we created this in Patrick's Way, a Camino of Ireland. What we didn't really realise is that if you're a real pilgrim, you're coming along and you're asking people to support you. You know, we were thinking, well, they're going to come and stay in hotels. If you're a real pilgrim, like we had one a few weeks ago, a German chap, he was a priest, and a real pilgrimage is where you call on the hospitality of others. Now, the Benedictines are really into this, and they provide a service where you can come and stay for free. But he was staying in barns and stuff, you know, and so it's quite it's a mindset. Anyway, the St. Patrick Centre also does lots of charitable. We're a charity ourselves. We do lots of charitable activities. We try and raise money for that. The last slide there was we raise money for young people, particularly over Christmas, who may, you know, their families may not be in a great way. So we raise money for social services, and we would collect 300 or 400 gifts a year to give to families in need. And then so we've gone through it. You've learned the story of St. Patrick. Eventually he goes around the northern half of Ireland and he dies in Downpatrick, and that's kind of, that's it. We have to guess the rest. But you've got to the stage where Patrick he's been remembered by the early monks because he founded Armagh. He's been remembered by Jean de Courcy, and he built a cathedral to him. It was reinvigorated then. That's where the snakes come in. Because John de Courcy got someone called Jocelyn, who was a monk from Barrow-in-Furness. He got him over to Inch Abbey, and he wrote the Legend of the Snakes. Okay, so we spun for a second time. And then we've got the new way of looking at St. Patrick, which is the Irish Diaspora, people going out all over the world who wanted to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And this is just a quick note of some of the things. This is in America. Okay, so just to say, he wasn't Irish, of course. And you know, people drink green beer. They go into parades. They paint their toenails green. They eat corned beef and cabbage. Corned beef and cabbage was something that the early Irish actually ate in New York because they couldn't afford anything else. It's not that it comes from here. And you know, they throw in all sorts of things. This comes from Tourism Ireland. You know, 650,000 babies named after St. Patrick in the US in the last 100 years. The national colour of Ireland, as they say there, does anybody know what the national colour of Ireland is? It's not green, it's blue. Yeah. So Patrick's colour was blue. It's more medieval colour, but the national colour of, if you look at the President of Ireland's flag, it is blue, because that's the national colour. So this idea of green comes in later. And, you know, they're just talking about how many churches, 450 churches in America alone. But over St. Patrick's Day, and it's been extended, you know, places like Dublin have St. Patrick's Week. And really all this has been fueled by, firstly, in the 19th century, people moving away even before that, actually, if you're interested in where it originally came from, it actually came, you think it came from a sort of an Irish nationalist community, but actually it wasn't started in America by Irish nationalists. It was started in America by Presbyterians. Yeah, they started it in Boston in the 1730s. They started it in the 1730s in Boston as a kind of fraternal organization to bring people, you know, there's so many Scots-Irish who were moving over there to bring them all together and to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. And then eventually it became important for the British colonial service, 1752. So 1737, you're talking about Boston, but the 1750s, they were celebrating it in New York. And it was really a recruitment day for people of Irish extraction to join the British colonial army. Okay, and then eventually, whenever we come into the 1840s, by the time you get to the 1840s, then there's many more people coming from the island of Ireland, fleeing the famine, and it becomes more of a day that's sort of representing maybe, I suppose you would think maybe more from a nationalist community or the southernmost parts of Ireland, you know. And this is how they celebrate in some places. Now, if you're in Boston, they still dress up in the 1700s gear. In the Siege of Boston in the 1770s, whenever they were trying to, the War of Independence, the password to get in and out was, anybody know? St. Patrick. St. Patrick was the password to get past the barricades to get in and out of Boston in the Siege of Boston. So they will dress up like this. St. Patrick's Day in New York, of course, is celebrated its 250th anniversary. I was there for that. It's just a bananas day. It's a crazy, crazy day. And, you know, you'll have people dressed up in this kind of caricature, but it's a day for firefighters and marching bands, and everybody gets involved. But strangely enough, that's New York, but the oldest St. Patrick's Day parade and the biggest, well, probably the second biggest in North America is where? Anybody know? It's not in New York, it's not in Boston. Nope. It's not even in America. It's in Montreal. Montreal. So many people from this part of the world particularly ended up in Montreal. So we have one of the biggest celebrations there. And you know, it's everywhere. And the thing about, so it starts with what I've described, but then it starts to go on because of river dance and Irish pubs. These are two huge exports. And those things propagate communities all over the world to want to be involved in something Irish, and the something Irish became, well, why don't we do a St. Patrick's Day? So we have it in, we're in China with St. Patrick's Day, and we are in Japan, Russia. Can I mention Russia? So, you know, it's a global, it's the biggest cultural event annually staged in the world, and it's part of your history and your heritage. And the thing to do is to try and connect those things together, and that's not easy. But the fact that people celebrate our history and heritage, they need to be reminded about that. So whenever they come to this part of the world, they should be celebrating it with us. Okay. Thank
you. Okay, just want to say a big thank you. That was very insightful. And we at Lisbon Museum and Irish Living Centre, thank you very much, Dr. Campbell.